You clicked because of that title, and yes, this is the night it truly began. The crystal wine glass trembled slightly in my hand, reflecting the harsh laughter at the dinner table. Sarah's words echoed in my ears. You'll never own property. Even Dad's nod weighed heavier than the oak dining chairs surrounding us. The air smelled faintly of roasted chicken and polished silver, but beneath it lingered the metallic tension of judgment. The words on the thumbnail were only a fraction of the truth. For 2 years, I had handed her $3,200 every month, silent, compliant, watching my dreams sit in someone else's name. Yet in the quiet of that evening, something inside me snapped. A slow-burning ember beneath a polished veneer of calm. I ran my fingers over the sleek edge of my phone, a symbol of the control I was about to reclaim. The next day, I called my property manager. Whatever the title promised. This is where the truth begins. Ownership isn't about permission. It's about daring to take what's yours. The chandelier above the dining table threw soft, golden light over the polished oak, each reflection shimmering like judgment. I sat at the head of the table, hands folded neatly in front of me, though inside my pulse thudded like a drumbeat. Sarah laughed, that sharp, calculating laugh I'd known my entire life, and leaned back with the ease of someone who believed the world had already handed her everything. You'll never own property, she said, tilting her wine glass just enough to catch the light. The crystal trembled slightly in my fingers, though I hadn't touched it. Her words echoed in the room, bouncing off the high ceilings and engraved silverware. Dad didn't even flinch. Stick to renting forever, he added, his tone casual but final, as if the verdict had been sealed decades ago. The aroma of roasted chicken and herbs masked a thicker tension, one I could feel pressing against my ribs. My mind spun, cataloging every humiliation. Every month of rent I'd quietly handed over for a place that wasn't mine. I smiled faintly, polite, almost serene. You're probably right, I said, my voice soft, betraying nothing. Inside, the ember of defiance smoldered, careful not to ignite too soon. My eyes flicked to the wineglass again, the delicate crystal so easily shattered, yet capable of holding something far stronger than it seemed. The conversation moved on, laughter and chatter filling the gaps, but I hardly heard it. The clink of cutlery against plates, the faint hiss of the wine pouring, the rustle of napkins, each mundane sound sharpened the edges of my awareness. I could feel the silent ledger of my life balancing, 2 years, $3,200 per month. A quiet river of my efforts flowing straight into their pockets. I pictured the apartment I dreamed of, the keys I hadn't yet touched, the name on the deeds I had not yet claimed. It was a faraway cityscape in my mind, the skyline gleaming with promise, distant but attainable. The polished table reflected not just our faces, but the truth I would not voice tonight. And yet, in that silence, a quiet fire sparked. One day, this dinner, this laughter, this condescension, it would meet its reckoning. The ember of quiet defiance began to flicker, subtle but relentless, warming the cold restraint I had carried for too long. 2 years had passed, each month a quiet ritual of compliance. I sat at my small desk in the dim glow of a desk lamp, the stacks of rent receipts growing taller with every payment, a paper monument to my own restraint. Each envelope felt heavier than the last, pressing down on my chest with the weight of silent resentment. The rhythm of life had become mechanical. I would wake, make coffee, check emails, and transfer the rent without a word. Sarah never asked how I was, never acknowledged my effort. She only counted the money and smiled with that faint, smug curl of satisfaction. The sound of the bank app confirming each transaction was a dull, bitter ping, echoing in my mind like a metronome, keeping time to my patience and frustration. Every receipt I placed neatly atop the last felt like a brick added to a fortress, her fortress, one built from my labor, my compliance, my silent acquiescence. The paper was crisp, cold to the touch, symbolic of a control I had allowed to dominate my life. Occasionally, I would pause, staring at the neat rows of numbers and signatures. imagining them etched into my memory like tally marks of suppressed ambition. I remembered sitting in that same apartment 2 years ago, full of hope, believing that following the rules and staying compliant would eventually yield respect, autonomy, and perhaps freedom. Instead, every month's payment became a reminder. Dreams deferred, independence postponed, and my voice muffled beneath a clinking of coins. I never wanted to spend this way. The apartment walls seemed to close in at times, the hum of the heater sounding like a whisper of mockery. I could almost feel Sarah's presence behind me, eyes sharp, judgment subtle, but unrelenting. Even in solitude, the weight of obligation pressed down. And yet I kept moving, calculating, surviving, pretending. But beneath the monotony, a quiet tension had begun to grow, almost imperceptible, like water slowly eroding stone. My thoughts drifted to the apartment I longed for, the keys I had yet to grasp, the space that would finally bear my name. Every calculation, every delayed indulgence, every silent payment was a stepping stone toward that moment. A moment when the balance would finally shift. Every dollar I gave was another brick in her fortress, but mine was coming. And when it arrived, it would not just topple walls, it would reclaim everything I had ever been told I could never have. The apartment was silent, save for the distant hum of the city beyond the windows. Neon lights flickered against the glass, casting fragmented reflections that seemed almost like another life, one where I had already claimed the independence I craved. I sank into the worn leather armchair, the fabric familiar beneath my fingers, and let my thoughts drift into the quiet spaces between reality and desire. For 2 years, I had watched Sarah prosper from my labor, from the money I surrendered month after month, and each transaction had carved a deeper groove of frustration into my mind. The injustice of it burned quietly, a constant ember behind my ribs. I stared at the darkened skyline, imagining each window as a possibility. Some lived freely, some trapped, some indifferent, and wondered why. I had allowed my own potential to be fenced off for so long. The reflections in the glass seemed to multiply, creating ghostly versions of myself. One obedient, paying rent silently. One angry, simmering with unspoken defiance. And one I barely recognized, standing at the threshold of opportunity, waiting. I reached out, pressing my fingertips against the cool surface, as if I could touch the life I longed for and pull it closer. Memories surfaced, unbidden, evenings spent counting bills, mornings quietly calculating savings, and the countless small sacrifices made in the name of patience. The apartment felt both sanctuary and cage, a space of comfort that also reminded me of the freedom denied. I traced the edge of the window frame, feeling the polished coldness, and realized the contradiction. The same city that confined me on one side promised limitless horizons on the other. A breeze swept through the slightly ajar window, carrying the faint scent of roasted chestnuts and asphalt after rain. It was a small reminder that the world outside moved forward, indifferent to my hesitation. Each sound, the distant siren, the hum of a late-night bus, the muted chatter from neighboring apartments seemed to echo the rhythm of life I had not yet seized. And then the thought surfaced, clear and deliberate. Waiting had been necessary, but waiting was over. The path forward was not impulsive anger or petty revenge. It would be calculated, elegant, precise. Every resource I had accumulated, every lesson learned in silence, could now be leveraged into action. The ember of quiet defiance had grown into a deliberate spark, illuminating the contours of a plan that had already begun forming in the shadows of my mind. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to smile softly, not at them, not at my losses, but at the inevitability of what was to come. The city lights reflected in the windows seemed to wink back, conspiratorial, acknowledging a future finally within reach. A plan begins forming. Not impulsive, but deliberate, and with it, the first real taste of freedom. The soft glow of the laptop illuminated my face, sharp against the dim light of the apartment. Fingers hovered over the keyboard, poised with the quiet excitement of someone standing at the threshold of possibility. Property listings scrolled endlessly, each image a miniature promise of autonomy, each price tag a challenge I was determined to meet. The air smelled faintly of coffee, strong and bitter, grounding me in the present even as my mind raced ahead to futures yet unclaimed. I leaned closer to the screen, studying floor plans, square footage, and neighborhood statistics with meticulous care. Every listing was more than a building. It was a symbolic threshold between compliance and control, between giving away my life in rent and taking it back in ownership. The numbers danced in my mind, calculations forming silently, invisible architecture shaping the strategy of my next months. The hum of the city outside seeped in. Through the slightly open window, a distant siren, a bus rattling over asphalt, the faint murmur of conversations drifting from neighboring apartments. Each sound anchored me, reminding me that the world moved in real time. But so could knowledge, I realized, was the only currency I had not yet fully spent. The tool that could turn quiet resentment into deliberate action. I pulled out a notebook, scribbling notes on financing options, property taxes, down payments, and potential rental income. The pages became a mosaic of possibilities. Each calculation a stepping stone across the river of doubt that had long separated me from independence. I paused to glance at the city skyline beyond the window, the same one that had reflected my yearning in countless sleepless nights, and imagined myself living in a space that bore my name. Not hers. Emails were sent to mortgage brokers, appointments scheduled with financial advisors, and webinars queued on investment strategies. Each step was deliberate, careful, and strategic. Impulsive action had never been the path to lasting change. The apartment no longer felt like a cage but a control room, a command center from which I could orchestrate the reclamation of my life. I paused again, staring at the glowing images of potential homes. The sleek kitchens, polished hardwood floors, and sunlit balconies became more than aspiration. They were symbols of a life I was entitled to, yet had been denied for too long. Every detail, from doorknobs to floor plans, became a part of my mental map toward freedom. Hope, once quiet and tentative, surged into something tangible. The ember of defiance now burned steadily, fueled by insight, preparation, and relentless calculation. This was the first true step, not in fantasy, but in reality, toward reclaiming what was rightfully mine. Knowledge becomes power. The evening was quiet. The apartment bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp. When a text from Sarah arrived, "Did you transfer the rent yet?" Don't make me chase it. My fingers tightened around the edge of my coffee mug. The ceramic cooled beneath my grip, though inside a storm had begun to churn. 2 years of silent payments, of bending under her words. And still she wielded the same authority, the same smugness, as if the world still belonged to her. I replayed the countless family dinners in my mind. Sarah's laugh cutting through the air like a knife. Dad's nods of approval sealing my supposed limitations. Each memory pressed against me, heavy as the stacks of rent receipts piled neatly on my desk. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant wail of a city siren, the faint clatter of the neighbor's television, all of it amplified the tension. The sense that I had been invisible in my own life. Anger bubbled up, sudden and electric, but alongside it came clarity. I could no longer ignore the injustice, the slow erosion of self that had been masked by polite compliance. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor, the sound sharp and almost accusatory in the quiet room. My hand caught the wine glass left from dinner earlier in the week, fragile, delicate, a crystal emblem of all the times I had silenced myself. The glass slipped. Shards scattered across the floor, catching the lamplight like tiny stars shattered on the ground. The sound was cathartic, a punctuation mark on 2 years of restraint. In that moment, the emotions I had carried quietly, frustration, resentment, yearning, crystallized into a singular resolve. I could feel the shift inside me. A pivot from passive endurance to deliberate action. I paced the apartment, each step measured, each breath steadying the turmoil inside. The ember of defiance had become a flame, illuminating not just the injustices I had endured but the path forward. No longer would I whisper agreement when I wanted to speak. No longer would I fund someone else's fortress while my own dreams remained boxed away. By the time I sank back into the chair, the shards of glass sparkling at my feet, a plan had already begun to take shape in my mind. It was not impulsive, not vengeful for its own sake. It was precise, strategic, and inevitable. The anger was a tool, the clarity a compass, and the scattered glass a symbol. The silence of the past was over. I picked up the notebook where I had been mapping property strategies, flipped it open, and began writing again. Each word deliberate. The moment had arrived. Silence is over. The first rays of dawn crept across the apartment floor, pale gold cutting through the blinds as I sat hunched over my desk. A fresh notebook lay open beside a laptop, its pages already crowded with calculations, projections, and strategies. This was no longer a dream or quiet yearning. It was a plan, precise and deliberate, each detail scrutinized like a blueprint for conquest. I began by mapping timelines, breaking down the months ahead into actionable steps. Every savings target, every scheduled appointment with financial advisors, every potential property showing was logged meticulously on the calendar pinned to the wall. It was more than organization. It was control, a visual manifestation of the power I was reclaiming. The ticking of the wall clock became a metronome to my planning, each second an echo of the patience that had brought me here. Next came the ledger. I spread past rent receipts, bank statements, and saved pay stubs across the desk, arranging them in neat rows. They were no longer symbols of submission, but tools of strategy, evidence of discipline that could now fuel independence. As I traced the numbers with my finger, I felt a satisfaction deeper than any paycheck. Every cent had a purpose, every sacrifice a reward awaiting in the near future. I consulted experts discreetly, phone calls with mortgage brokers, online consultations with investment advisors, and careful discussions with accountants. Each conversation sharpened my understanding, revealing nuances I hadn't considered, hidden costs, tax implications, optimal mortgage rates. Knowledge accumulated quietly, invisibly, but it was accumulating like capital, growing heavier with potential impact. Even mundane choices became strategic. Which apartment buildings to target, which neighborhoods offered long-term appreciation. Financial products would accelerate acquisition. Every decision was deliberate. I kept the laptop angled away from the window, aware that even casual observers could sense the storm of precision brewing behind the calm. The city hummed beyond the glass, indifferent to my plans, yet somehow synchronizing with the rhythm of my resolve. A distant siren, the muffled engine of a passing car, the soft chirp of morning birds, each sound underscored the reality. Time would not wait. But neither would I. The apartment no longer felt like a cage. It was a command center, a war room where the architecture of my future was drafted in quiet, steady strokes. By mid-morning, the framework was complete. The calendar reflected every move, the ledger every resource, and my mind every contingency. I paused to glance at the city skyline, sunlight catching the glass towers like promises etched in stone. Each skyscraper seemed to whisper a challenge. Claim what is yours, or watch others do it for you. I inhaled deeply, savoring the tension, the anticipation, the satisfaction of tactical patience. Every detail mattered. This would be precise. No step would be wasted, no emotion mismanaged, no opportunity overlooked. The ember of defiance had grown into a controlled blaze, and with this strategy, it would become unstoppable. I closed the notebook gently, but the planning would not stop. Each calculated move was now alive, a part of the momentum I had cultivated over years of quiet endurance. And for the first time in a long time, I felt entirely in command of what was mine, not just my finances, but my future, my independence, and the inevitable reckoning that would follow. Dinner arrived with all the familiar pomp: roasted chicken glistening under the dining room chandelier, a silver gravy boat perfectly polished, and the faint aroma of baked bread curling through the air. I sat at the table, hands folded neatly atop a linen napkin, my posture calm, controlled, almost effortless. On the surface, I was the same obedient family member I had always been. Beneath it, every thought, every calculation, every heartbeat was a careful act of defiance. Sarah chatted with exaggerated warmth, recounting stories from work and her friends, her laughter bright and sharp. But I let it wash over me like soundproof glass. Dad nodded occasionally, adding a word or two of casual approval, completely unaware that the quiet smile I wore concealed clenched fists and an unyielding mind. I sipped my wine slowly, letting the rich burgundy stain the rim of the glass. A symbol of patience carefully maintained dot every question from Sarah. Every teasing remark about my eternal renting, I answered politely, softly, with measured tone. Yes, I'll take care of that, I said. Of course, no problem. The words felt like velvet masking steel. On the surface, I was compliant. In truth, each syllable was part of a carefully choreographed performance, a social camouflage that kept my growing plan invisible. The city lights outside the window reflected off the polished dining table, fragmenting our images into multiple reflections. I studied them briefly, Sarah's confident smile, Dad's placid expression, my own calm face. It was a visual reminder of the duality I carried, one self-controlled and courteous, the other strategic and resolute. Calculating each move silently while the family remained blissfully unaware. I let the conversation drift toward trivial matters, weather, minor workplace gossip, the latest neighborhood events. Inside, I was orchestrating steps toward independence, confirming appointments with mortgage brokers, reviewing investment strategies, and mentally assigning deadlines. Each small interaction with the family became a cover, a smokescreen for the larger game quietly unfolding. The clinking of silverware against plates, the gentle murmur of voices. Even the distant hum of traffic outside became part of the symphony of control. I measured my expressions carefully, an eyebrow raised here, a small laugh there, ensuring no hint of my inner fire betrayed the calculated patience that had brought me this far. Sarah paused mid-sentence, glancing at me with a smirk, as if testing whether I had absorbed her latest jab. I met her gaze, smiled faintly, and said, "Of course, that makes sense," the words dripping with politeness, masking the storm beneath. She laughed, satisfied, unaware that the game had already changed, that each polite acknowledgement was now a step toward her eventual astonishment. As the evening wound down, the dessert was served, coffee poured, and casual chatter resumed. I sipped slowly, letting the warmth spread, feeling the quiet thrill of progress. Every polite nod, every measured smile, every silent acknowledgement of their control was simultaneously a subtle assertion of my own. They laughed, unaware the game has changed. The facade of compliance was a shield, and behind it, strategy, patience, and resolve had taken root, ready to bloom into decisive action when the time was right. The soft hum of the laptop filled the quiet apartment as I scrolled through the final property listings, each click bringing me closer to the goal I had envisioned for so long. My savings, painstakingly accumulated over months of careful budgeting, had reached the threshold needed for a down payment. I traced my finger along the polished edge of the desk, imagining the key that would soon rest in my palm, a tangible emblem of autonomy, authority, and triumph. The day I had chosen to make the first call to the property manager, I rehearsed the conversation in my mind multiple times. The numbers had been double-checked, the financing confirmed, and the forms prepared. Even the slightest misstep could unravel months of effort, and I felt a surge of meticulous satisfaction knowing every detail was accounted for. Each payment transfer, each signed document, each email confirmation became a silent victory, stacking atop the last like bricks in a foundation that would soon support the life I deserved. I watched the calendar pinned to the wall, marking off milestones with careful strokes of a pen. Every day passed with deliberate precision. Each task completed, a quiet drumbeat heralding progress. At night, when the apartment was still, I imagined myself holding the key for the first time. The metal was cool and solid, a physical manifestation of a long-fought battle, the weight a reminder of all I had endured. I could almost hear the click of the lock turning, a sound that would echo through my mind as both liberation and quiet revenge. The city beyond my window seemed to pulse in tandem with my anticipation. Distant car horns, the soft murmur of neighbors, and the occasional wail of a siren were no longer background noise. They became part of the rhythm of my strategy, each sound underscoring that life moved forward. But so would I. On my own terms, I kept the progress hidden from Sarah, careful not to betray the magnitude of my advancement. Every interaction, every polite nod, every feigned indifference reinforced the illusion of compliance, while the foundation of my independence solidified behind closed doors. The duality of my existence, the calm, smiling exterior, juxtaposed with the deliberate, unstoppable momentum beneath, fueled a growing confidence. Documents were signed, initial deposits made, and financing approved. Every step brought me closer to claiming not just a property, but a statement that 2 years of patience, restraint, and silent effort were not wasted. The apartment I had longed for, previously an abstraction in my mind, now existed in tangible form on paper, ready to be transformed into a space that bore my name and my authority. Late one evening, I held the contract in my hands, feeling the weight of the pages, the promise of what was to come. I imagined the key once more, small and simple, yet imbued with the power to reshape my life. It symbolized more than ownership. It represented victory, liberation, and the quiet satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly. A quiet smile curved my lips as I placed the documents carefully into a folder. The metal paperclip a tiny talisman of triumph. Ownership was near. Unclaimed and unstoppable. The next family gathering arrived with all the usual fanfare. A bright dining room, gleaming silverware, and Sarah's confident laughter filling the space. But this time, something was different. I sat across from her, calm and composed, my expression pleasant but carefully neutral, masking the storm of momentum I had been cultivating behind the scenes. Every word I spoke, every subtle gesture was calculated to plant seeds of doubt. Small fissures in her sense of control. Sarah began the usual taunts, a sly smile curling at the corners of her lips. So, still renting? She teased, her eyes scanning for any sign of weakness. I offered only a serene nod, sipping my water slowly, letting the silence between her words stretch just long enough to unsettle her. It was a pause that spoke volumes, quiet confidence where she had expected fluster. At that moment, I noticed the mirror on the wall behind her, reflecting both our faces in a single frame. Her posture remained perfect, yet in the mirrored reflection, saw the faint furrow of her brow, the almost imperceptible tightening around her mouth. The reflection became a canvas of shifting power dynamics, a silent indicator that the control she believed she wielded was beginning to waver. During casual conversation, I slipped in subtle hints of financial acumen, discussions of market trends, property values, and investment strategies. Each remark was innocent on the surface, but meticulously designed to suggest knowledge and capability beyond her assumptions. Sarah's laughs grew slightly forced, her words hesitating for the first time in years. The air in the room seemed heavier, charged with tension she couldn't quite name. I watched as she checked her phone, distracted, the casual mask of superiority slipping for a fraction of a second. In that instant, I realized that the psychological shift was underway. My quiet patience and meticulous preparation had begun to undermine her confidence without confrontation, without argument. Each polite acknowledgement, each nod, each carefully timed smile served as a subtle reminder the dynamic had changed. The facade of compliance I had maintained for years was now a strategic weapon, and she had no idea it was aimed directly at her. The mirror became my symbol of authority, reflecting not only the room but the invisible hierarchy I was quietly reasserting by the end of the evening. Sarah's laughter sounded slightly sharper, slightly uncertain. She tried to maintain dominance, but the cracks were forming. Every question she asked me about mundane matters, bills, errands, small updates, now carried attention. A hesitation, A subtle recognition that I was no longer passive, no longer the one she could dismiss with a smirk. I left the gathering with the same calm exterior I had arrived with. But inside, a thrill of quiet triumph surged. The battle had not been declared openly, but it was underway. Each calculated word, each deliberate gesture, each moment of poised observation had shifted the psychological balance in my favor. The reflection in the mirror lingered in my mind long after I had left. A metaphor for the invisible chessboard where the pieces were finally moving as I had intended. Sarah's dominance, once unchallenged, now bore subtle fractures. The sister feels cracks forming in her dominance, and I could sense it. It was no longer a matter of if the balance would tip, but when. The game had changed entirely, and the end, quiet, inevitable. Precise was already in motion. The family brunch was set under a canopy of soft sunlight filtering through the bay windows, casting long fractured shadows across the polished wooden floor. I arrived with the same calm demeanor I had cultivated for weeks. A serene smile resting lightly on my lips, masking the meticulous strategy humming behind every gesture. The air smelled faintly of fresh pastries and brewed coffee. Yet beneath it lingered a tension that no aroma could soften. Sarah was already there, radiant in a designer dress, her laughter ringing across the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to unquestioned dominance. I greeted her with a polite nod, a slight smile, and sat across the table, the mirrored reflection in the window behind her catching both our images. For a brief moment I studied her posture, upright, flawless, but her eyes flicked to me and lingered slightly too long. Subtle cracks were beginning to show. The conversation began innocuously. Small talk about work, neighborhood gossip, and the latest social events. But I knew the importance of timing and phrasing. I dropped carefully calculated hints about my growing investments and financial planning, casual mentions, almost as if I were merely indulging in small talk. Yet each statement carried weight, a subtle assertion of competence and independence. Sarah's polite smiles wavered. Her previously effortless humor, now slightly strained at the symbolic centerpiece of the room, drew my attention. The old clock above the fireplace, its hands frozen at 3:17. I silently acknowledged it as a metaphor. Time, once her ally in maintaining control over me, was now running out. Each tick she imagined in her mind, each pause, each hesitation was a reminder that the balance of authority was shifting. The broken clock no longer marked leisure and dominance. It counted down the subtle erosion of her perceived superiority as plates were cleared and dessert was served. I let my eyes meet hers, holding them with calm intensity. The polite facade remained, but underneath the tension was palpable. I spoke softly, almost conversationally, about the importance of long-term planning and property acquisition, framing my words as reflections on adult responsibility rather than confrontation. Each phrase was a probe, gently testing the boundaries of her control. She attempted to redirect the conversation, her smile a little tighter, her gestures slightly more deliberate. But I did not falter. Every word, every pause, every breath was deliberate. I could feel the subtle shift in energy at the table, the unease creeping into her carefully maintained composure. The power dynamics, once unquestioned, were bending ever so slightly, like light through a prism refracted, fragmented, and revealing new angles she could not fully control. The lunch ended. Coffee sipped and polite farewells exchanged. Yet I felt the resonance of the confrontation linger. The city outside buzzed on, oblivious to the quiet upheaval unfolding in that sunlit room. I walked to the car with steady, measured steps, aware that the first true psychological engagement had been made and that it had landed with precision. The broken clock, the careful words, the poised demeanor, all elements of the encounter had served their purpose. Sarah, unaware of the depth of preparation and the layers of strategy beneath my calm exterior, had felt the first tremors of change. Her control, once unshakable, now bore subtle but unmistakable fractures. The tide is turning. But final victory is still unseen. The board has been set, the pieces have moved. And the inevitable collision of patience, planning, and resolve waits just beyond the horizon. The day had arrived with a clarity I had waited years to experience. Sunlight poured through the apartment windows, cutting across the polished surfaces of the desk where the contract lay neatly folded. I ran my fingers over the edges of the paper, feeling its weight, its promise. The down payment had cleared, the mortgage approved, and every iota of preparation I had cultivated over months, every calculation, every strategic interaction, every subtle maneuver had led to this moment. I dialed the property manager first. My fingers steady, voice calm, professional. Please stop accepting Sarah's rent payments, effective immediately. I said, each word deliberate, commanding without aggression. The pause on the other end of the line, brief but perceptible, felt like a confirmation that control had finally shifted. The money that had flowed into her hands for 2 long years would now redirect toward my own future, toward ownership. Independence and justice quietly wrought. The contract was signed electronically, a click of the mouse marking the culmination of careful planning. I reviewed the documents one final time, scanning the signatures, the legal clauses, and the terms. Every detail was in place, flawless, unassailable. This was no impulsive triumph. It was a calculated victory, the result of patience, intelligence, and restraint. The property, once an abstract dream, was now legally mine. The key rested in my hand. Small but potent, a tangible symbol of the transformation I had orchestrated. The cool metal was heavy, not in weight, but in significance. It represented every silent payment, every restrained smile, every late night spent planning, calculating, and strategizing. Holding it, I could feel the culmination of years of effort condensed into a single object, my power made manifest. I sat back in the chair, closing my eyes briefly to savor the quiet intensity of the moment. The apartment was still bathed in the soft afternoon light, and for the first time, I allowed myself a slow, deliberate exhale. The freedom, the autonomy, the triumph were not loud, not flamboyant. They were quiet, elegant, complete. Later that evening, I met Sarah casually at a family gathering, maintaining the same composed, polite exterior I had perfected over the past months. Her eyes flicked toward me, expecting the same familiar compliance, the same quiet acceptance of her dominance. But I carried myself differently now, confident, assured, subtly untouchable. I let her attempt to jab at my financial status, her tone lightly teasing, and responded with calm acknowledgement. No aggression, no fear, no hint of uncertainty. I could see the first flicker of doubt cross her eyes. The invisible foundation of superiority she had relied upon was shifting beneath her feet. And I sensed the cracks forming, subtle but undeniable. Her smug confidence, so long a fixture in our interactions, was beginning to crumble, even if she could not yet articulate why. The city's skyline glimmered beyond the windows, distant lights reflecting the trajectory of my triumph. Every meticulous step, from secret research to strategic interactions, from patient restraint to deliberate action, had coalesced into this victory. The contract and the key were more than paper and metal. They were symbols of power regained, independence claimed, and justice executed with precision. I allowed myself a small smile, discreet yet unwavering. The process had been long, the planning meticulous, and the victory quiet but absolute. Sarah's laughter, once so sharp and untouchable, now carried a note of uncertainty, a subtle tremor that reflected the shift in authority. I had orchestrated with care. The financial coup was complete. Ownership was mine. Rent payments ceased. And the invisible ledger of power had finally balanced. Sister's smug confidence begins to crumble, and the stage was set for the final acts of revelation, confrontation, and closure. The apartment was quiet now. The city beyond its windows, moving with the rhythm of life, indifferent to personal victories and losses. I stood before the full-length mirror, the frame catching the last rays of the evening sun, and studied my reflection. The person staring back was familiar, yet irrevocably changed, calm, composed, and quietly triumphant. In that mirrored image, I saw the culmination of years of patience, planning, and persistence distilled into a single, resolute self. The events of the past months replayed in my mind like a slow-motion montage. The family dinners, the subtle jabs, the carefully masked compliance, and the meticulous financial strategy. Each moment had been a brushstroke on the canvas of transformation. I traced the contours of my own face in the mirror, noting the serenity that had replaced the earlier tension, the quiet confidence that now radiated without arrogance. I thought of Sarah. Her smugness, once impenetrable, now fractured. The psychological chess I had played was complete. She had been unaware that every polite nod, every carefully timed comment, every silent action had been part of a larger plan. The shards of her dominance, imperceptible at first, had grown into cracks she could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. In that, there was satisfaction, not cruelty, but the validation of years of silent endurance finally manifesting as quiet justice. The key rested on the counter beside me, small and heavy with significance. It symbolized more than ownership of property. It represented autonomy, strategic mastery, and the reclamation of a life that had been quietly dictated by others. I picked it up, letting it sit in my palm for a long moment, and felt a pulse of empowerment flow through me. The metal was cool, unyielding, and absolute, a reminder that victory often comes in subtle, deliberate measures rather than grand declarations. Yet with triumph came reflection. The journey had been costly, not in money, but in time, emotional energy, and the quiet erosion of complacency that had once dulled my ambition. I understood fully the weight of restraint and the patience required to convert quiet defiance into decisive action. Revenge, I realized, was not a spectacle. It was a slow, precise alignment of cause-consequence. An opportunity. I turned to the window, gazing at the city skyline. The skyscrapers shimmering like constellations grounded in glass and steel. Life moved relentlessly forward outside, just as it had within. But unlike the past, I now moved with intention and control. The reflections in the glass mirrored the quiet strength that had taken root, the self who would no longer be invisible, overlooked or constrained by someone else's ego. The family, once a source of subtle oppression, would continue to occupy the same physical space. Yet their perception of me had irrevocably shifted. Sarah's laughter, Dad's casual jabs, all the small ways dominance had been exercised. They had lost their power. I realized the true cost of empowerment was not in confrontation or spectacle, but in the quiet, unwavering commitment to act strategically, consistently, and with emotional clarity. I placed the key back on the counter and looked once more into the mirror. The reflection was no longer of someone waiting, hoping, or silently enduring. It was of someone who had quietly mastered their circumstances, turned patience into action, and claimed what was rightfully theirs. The mirror held a story of transformation, a narrative of subtle triumph, and a testament to the power of strategic resilience. Revenge doesn't scream, it whispers. It does not need witnesses, fanfare, or acknowledgement. It unfolds quietly, deliberately, and with a precision that is almost invisible until the moment of full realization arrives. And in that whisper, I found not only victory, but peace, clarity, and a profound understanding of my own strength. The brunch table at the family restaurant was alive with the familiar clatter of silverware, the hum of conversations from neighboring tables, and the faint scent of freshly baked pastries wafting from the kitchen. Sarah sat across from me, radiant and confident, clearly expecting the same compliance she had always commanded. But I carried a quiet calm, an unshakable certainty, and a folder that contained the culmination of every silent effort I had made over the past 2 years. The moment arrived subtly. As she laughed at a story she believed showcased her cleverness, I slid the folder across the table toward her. "I think it's time you see the full picture," I said, voice steady and unflinching. Her eyes widened at the weight of the gesture, but she still smiled, masking suspicion with practiced confidence. I opened the folder deliberately, revealing The neatly organized ledger of rent payments, bank statements, and signed property documents. Each page was a silent testament to my years of patience and planning. Sarah leaned in, curiosity mixing with confusion, her confident facade beginning to crack. The evidence was irrefutable. Every payment she had received, every subtle assertion of dominance had quietly been redirected toward my ultimate independence. The room seemed too still for a heartbeat. Silverware clinked against plates more sharply than usual. Conversations around the table faded into background hum. And even the sunlight filtering through the restaurant windows seemed sharper, illuminating the ledger like a spotlight on truth. Sarah's eyes flicked from page to page, disbelief and shock intermingled with a rising tide of betrayal. What is this?" she stammered, her voice betraying the crack in her armor. I remained calm, serene even, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of realization to settle in. I had no need to shout, no need for dramatic words. The evidence spoke for itself. The symbolic power of the ledger hit her fully in that moment. Each meticulously logged payment, each documented transaction, represented not just financial control, but strategic mastery. She had assumed superiority, believing that I had remained compliant, submissive, and dependent. Now, the truth struck like a quiet thunderclap. Her assumptions had been entirely wrong, Dad. Seated beside her, finally glanced at the folder, his expression a mix of astonishment and dawning comprehension. I didn't realize," he began, the words faltering as he pieced together the scope of my quiet triumph. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was a testament to the subtle power shift, the long overdue correction of a dynamic that had favored her for too long. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she closed the ledger, her confident posture now uneven. The playful edge in her voice, the casual superiority she wielded so easily, had evaporated, replaced by a faint awareness that control had slipped through her hands. She glanced at me, searching for some sign of humility or regret, but found only calm determination. An unwavering resolve that had been quietly forged over months of meticulous effort. The restaurant noise slowly returned, but the tension lingered like an unbroken cord. Family members nearby glanced subtly, sensing the shift in energy at our table, even if they could not fully grasp its origin. The ledger, once an object of mundane bookkeeping, had become a symbolic artifact of justice, empowerment, and the quiet triumph of patience over arrogance. I finally spoke, soft but deliberate. Everything you believed about my dependence, about your control, was never the truth. It's been years in the making, and now it's real. The words were measured, precise, and final, an assertion, not just of ownership, but of independence, competence, and self-respect. Sarah exhaled sharply, a mixture of shock, anger, and the beginnings of reluctant acknowledgement. Her eyes, once sharp with superiority, now reflected the first recognition that the game had irrevocably changed. She realized the quiet, deliberate strategy she had underestimated, the subtle patience that had led to this undeniable revelation. Family must reconcile with the new reality. The ledger, the property, the quiet months of planning, all were now visible, undeniable, and unchallengeable. Sarah's dominance had been broken, not through confrontation, but through precision, persistence, and the elegant execution of a long-silenced plan. The apartment was quiet as I returned from the family gathering, the evening light casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. In my hand rested the key to the property I had worked so meticulously to claim, its cool metal weight, a tangible reminder of every calculated step, every patient effort, every silent act of perseverance. This was no longer a dream or an abstract goal. It was reality, tangible and unstoppable. I placed the key on the counter and let my fingers linger over it, feeling the texture, the solidity, the quiet authority it represented. Each groove, each notch, each curve of the metal was more than craftsmanship. It was the embodiment of autonomy, a symbol of liberation from years of belittlement and subtle oppression. The key was mine, and through it, so was the life I had painstakingly built. The memories of past dinners, the taunts, the laughter that had once cut through my confidence, surfaced briefly. I recalled Sarah's smug eyes, Dad's nods of casual approval, and the subtle erosion of my self-worth as I funneled payment after payment into someone else's hands. But instead of anger or bitterness, I felt clarity. The clarity of someone who had endured, served, and then acted with purpose. Every strategic move I had made, financial research, consultations, psychological maneuvers, and silent compliance had culminated in this moment. I had not just claimed property, I had claimed independence. The act of signing the final documents, stopping rent payments, and holding the key was a reclaiming of agency that no taunt, no laughter, and no past humiliation could undo. I walked through the apartment slowly, visualizing the life I would build. Each room became a stage for possibility. The living room for gatherings where I set the rules. The kitchen, a space for nourishment and creativity. The bedroom, a sanctuary for rest and reflection. The space itself seemed to acknowledge the shift, reflecting the light differently, echoing with potential. The key, small yet potent, symbolized every open door. Every boundary I could now define for myself. In that moment, I understood that empowerment is not loud, it is deliberate. Triumph does not announce itself with fanfare. It whispers through decisive action, through careful preparation, through the quiet, unyielding assertion of one's right to exist fully and independently. I allowed myself a slow smile, not one of malice or revenge, but of satisfaction and self-recognition. I paused before the mirror, holding the key lightly in my hand. The reflection staring back at me was not the tentative, silenced figure of years past. It was someone transformed, someone who had navigated every obstacle with patience, strategy, and integrity. The keys in my hand were not just instruments of property ownership. They were talismans of self-mastery, symbols that the narrative of my subjugation had ended. From the window, I watched the city move on, oblivious, indifferent, yet perfectly aligned with my own rhythm. I felt the weight of independence settle over me, comforting and energizing simultaneously. The struggle, the planning, the quiet, endurance, and the careful execution had all led here to this apex of empowerment. Every subtle act of resistance, every calculated pause, every strategic maneuver had contributed to this singular moment. The silence of the apartment, the cool weight of the key, the reflection in the mirror all coalesced into a cinematic tableau of victory. I breathed deeply, savoring the calm intensity of achievement. It was a triumph of mind, will, and persistence, rendered not in spectacle but in the quiet authority of someone fully in command of their life. The narrative of oppression ends. No longer would I be the quiet contributor to someone else's advantage. No longer the passive participant in their assumptions. No longer defined by limitations imposed by others. The key in my hand was proof, tangible and unassailable, that independence, empowerment, and self-determination were now my reality. The dining room was quiet, the polished table gleaming under the chandelier's soft glow. Sarah and Dad sat across from me, their expressions a mixture of confusion, defensiveness, and the faintest hint of apprehension. The air was thick with unspoken words, the tension almost tangible, yet I remained calm, composed, and resolute. This was no longer a room of belittlement. It was a neutral battleground where authority and respect would finally be clarified. Sarah opened her mouth, likely expecting sarcasm, accusation, or hesitation. But I met her gaze steadily, voice measured and unwavering. "The payments stop," I said simply, "and the property is officially mine. That's the reality now." Each word carried weight, precise and unflinching. It's devoid of anger but full of certainty. Dad's expression shifted. a flicker of surprise crossing his features as he processed the declaration. The familiar power dynamic once dictated by their assumptions. Their laughter, their casual dominance had been completely reversed. The ledger, the contracts, the key, everything was tangible proof, unassailable and definitive. Sarah tried to interject, her tone a mixture of incredulity and defensiveness. "But you've been paying rent for years. How is this even possible?" she asked, her voice slightly shaking, betraying her previously unassailable confidence. I smiled faintly, letting the calm intensity of my composure speak louder than any argument could. "Careful planning, patience, and action," I replied softly. That's all it took. The symbolic weight of the dining table, once a stage for their subtle mockery and belittlement, had shifted. It no longer represented judgment or superiority. Now, it was neutral, a platform for truth, for confrontation tempered with composure, for the assertion of rightful authority. Every plate, every gleaming silver utensil, every reflection in the polished wood mirrored the new equilibrium, calm, precise, and undeniable. Sarah's eyes flicked to the key resting near me on the table. She didn't speak, but the glance was loaded with understanding, the silent acknowledgement that her assumptions had been wrong. That control was no longer hers to wield. The ledger, the contracts, the months of unseen strategy had all culminated in a moment she could neither erase nor ignore. I allowed a quiet pause, letting the impact of my words settle. Authority no longer required aggression. It required clarity, preparation, and the unwavering courage to act when the time was right. Each second of silence was a reinforcement of the new reality. I was no longer the one to be diminished, the one to be mocked, or the one to be controlled. The room breathed differently now. Tension remained, but it was tempered by recognition and respect. Not the respect demanded by fear, but the acknowledgement of deliberate action and unshakable resolve. Dad's gaze softened slightly, an unspoken understanding that the dynamics had shifted, that the lessons of patience, strategy, and self-determination had been firmly illustrated. I gathered the contracts and key, placing them neatly into my bag, a symbolic gesture of independence and authority fully reclaimed. My calm demeanor, the measured precision of my words, and the quiet strength of my presence ensured the confrontation did not escalate into chaos, but instead resolved with undeniable clarity. Words no longer hurt. Authority is reclaimed. The room, once a stage of subtle oppression, now reflected the new hierarchy. I had transformed past frustrations into strategy, subjugation into autonomy, and patience into triumph. The family would remember this day not for anger or bitterness, but for the undeniable truth of independence earned and asserted. The room was quieter than usual, the remnants of family chatter fading into the background. Sarah sat alone at the edge of the living room, her usual confidence replaced by a tension she could not mask. The shattered wineglass from earlier, which had once symbolized the breaking point of my patience, had been carefully cleaned and placed on the sideboard. Its absence, subtle yet potent, mirrored the shift taking place within her. The chaos of domination replaced by the clarity of consequence. She ran her fingers along the edge of the sideboard, staring at the empty space where the broken glass had been, and for the first time she reflected. Memories of past dinners, the casual dismissals, the laughter that had been sharp rather than kind, all floated to the surface. Each recollection carried a sting she could no longer deny, not because of my words or actions, but because of the tangible evidence of my independence, the property key, the contracts, and the halted rent payments. Her mind replayed moments she had taken for granted, my quiet compliance, my subdued responses, my patience in the face of repeated belittlement. The realization that what she had interpreted as weakness was actually strategic restraint unsettled her deeply. The ledger of payments, the deliberate silence, the calculated patience all had been part of a plan she had never anticipated. A plan she had dismissed as impotent or naive. The room seemed to contract around her, the weight of her misjudgments pressing in. She remembered the nights I had spent quietly planning, researching property laws, saving money, and preparing every move with precision. Every sarcastic remark, every assumed superiority, every smirk she had worn now felt hollow, outdated, and painfully premature. The symbolism of the cleaned wine glass struck her most vividly. Where once it had represented an emotional breaking point, now its absence was a reflection of resolution and accountability. The disorder she had imposed, the subtle oppression she had exercised, had been transformed into a silent lesson. The consequences of underestimating someone who had endured, observed, and acted with deliberate care. Sarah's reflection on her behavior was uncomfortable but unavoidable. She could no longer rely on assumptions or inherited authority. She had been forced into introspection by the undeniable reality of my actions. Each subtle victory I had achieved, each financial milestone, each moment of quiet psychological maneuvering, each assertion of independence had been a mirror held up to her own conduct. She exhaled slowly, her eyes tracing the contours of the room, lingering on the key and the documents that now belonged to me. The symbols of my empowerment were everywhere, a tangible assertion of agency she could neither erase nor reclaim. The shock of recognition settled into a complex mixture of humility, regret, and grudging respect. Understanding, but not necessarily forgiveness, marked the emotional landscape she now navigated. Sarah realized the depth of her misjudgment and the extent to which her behavior had caused imbalance. Yet reconciliation was not immediate. The awareness was raw, introspective, and powerful, the first step in processing the shift in authority, the reallocation of power, and the tangible assertion of my autonomy. The room was silent except for the faint tick of the clock on the wall, a reminder that time moved forward regardless of realizations or reconciliations. Sarah's gaze lingered on the empty sideboard, the cleaned wine glass reflecting light subtly across the room. The metaphor was clear. The chaos she had initiated had been resolved. The past could not be undone. And the consequences of her actions were now fully evident. For the first time, she truly understood, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through the quiet, deliberate assertion of independence and the tangible symbols of success she had ignored for so long. The courthouse lobby was bright with natural light, the polished floors reflecting both the bustle of strangers and the quiet weight of significance in my own actions. I clutched the folder containing the final property deed, the notarized contracts, and the official notice confirming the cessation of all rent obligations to Sarah. Each document, meticulously prepared and legally binding, represented the culmination of years of patience, strategy, and subtle resistance sitting across from the notary. I watched as each signature was applied, each stamp pressed firmly onto the paper. The sound of the seal, crisp and final, resonated in the room like a muted gong of victory. The key to the property, cool and metallic in my hand, was more than a physical object. It was the embodiment of agency, autonomy, and the quiet triumph of deliberate action. Sarah had been informed, of course, but her presence was not required. The legal system, impartial and unyielding, validated my efforts in a way that words or confrontations could not. The ledger, the contracts, the months of careful planning, all were now codified into undeniable fact. The rent she had collected for years would never again pass through my hands. Redirected instead toward building a life I fully controlled. As I left the building, the city around me seemed transformed. Streets I had walked in silent frustration now felt like pathways to empowerment. The courthouse steps became a stage of subtle triumph. The polished handrail, a symbolic threshold between past submission and present authority. Every reflection in the glass doors mirrored a version of myself, confident, deliberate, and fully autonomous. Returning home, I placed the signed contract alongside the key on the counter, their combined presence radiating quiet legitimacy. The documents were not just paper. They were proof, tangible and indisputable, that the power dynamic had shifted permanently. The key, small yet potent, symbolized the door to independence. I had unlocked a threshold I would never relinquish. The family. Upon receiving official confirmation, could no longer dismiss or belittle my efforts. The legal validation removed ambiguity, leaving only the reality of accomplishment and authority. Sarah's prior confidence, once unshakable, now faced the incontrovertible reality that control had shifted. The quiet effectiveness of formal action rendered any further argument moot. I reflected briefly on the journey, the subtle psychological maneuvers, the silent endurance, the careful financial planning. Each step had been necessary, each decision deliberate. There was no need for spectacle. The quiet precision of the law, combined with personal diligence, ensured that victory was both absolute and undeniable. The room, bathed in afternoon light, reflected the solidity of accomplishment. The key, the contracts, and the notarized documents collectively symbolized more than property ownership. They were the embodiment of strategic patience, deliberate action, and the quiet reclamation of personal sovereignty. Justice is quiet, effective, undeniable. No dramatic confrontation, no theatrical display could have accomplished what patience, planning, and legal certainty had achieved. The narrative had shifted. The long years of belittlement and subtle oppression concluded, replaced by a reality defined by autonomy, authority, and the calm strength of deliberate triumph. The apartment was quiet, bathed in the soft amber glow of late afternoon sunlight that filtered through sheer curtains. I stood before the full-length mirror, the key resting lightly in my hand, and allowed myself a long, deliberate exhale. The reflection staring back at me was no longer the tentative, deferential figure of years past. It was someone composed, confident, and at peace, a self reshaped by patience, strategy, and resolve. I traced the contours of my reflection, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the calm in my eyes, the quiet strength now radiating without effort. Every moment of doubt, every silent frustration, every careful calculation had contributed to the person reflected back at me. This journey had not been about mere financial acquisition or the final triumph over Sarah's dominance. It had been about growth, self-realization, and the reclamation of personal dignity. The key in my hand gleamed softly in the afternoon light. Once a simple object, it had transformed into a symbol of empowerment, not because it unlocked a property, but because it represented deliberate action, persistence, and the manifestation of long-held ambition. The ledger, the contracts, the halted rent payments, all were echoes of a strategy that had begun with patience and culminated in undeniable autonomy. I allowed myself to recall the moments of tension and quiet struggle. The dinners where belittlement was served with a smile, the subtle psychological games, the months of silent endurance, and the calculated maneuvers that ultimately reversed the balance of power. Each memory was no longer painful. It was instructive, a testament to the efficacy of patience, clarity, and intentional action. The mirror became more than glass. It was a symbol of reflection, insight, and self-knowledge. I realized that true ownership was not solely about property or financial independence. It was about cultivating confidence, asserting boundaries, and acting with deliberation rather than impulsivity. The lessons of restraint, observation, and strategic patience were as valuable as any tangible asset I now held. The city beyond the window moved on, indifferent to personal victories and failures. Yet within these walls, a quiet mastery had been claimed. Each decision, each carefully considered step, each silent act of defiance and planning had combined to create not just a legal triumph, but a philosophical one. The empowerment I felt was rooted in understanding my worth, valuing my time, and refusing to allow another's assumptions to dictate my path. I let the keys slip gently from my fingers onto the counter, hearing the soft metallic click as it landed. It was a grounding moment, a reminder that while objects can symbolize achievement, the true essence of victory lies within oneself. The reflection in the mirror now spoke of wisdom earned, peace cultivated, and self-respect reclaimed. The journey had been as much inward as outward, a transformation of mind and spirit alongside material success. True ownership is not just property, self-respect reclaimed. The lesson was clear, the victory complete, and the narrative of dependency, ridicule, and subjugation finally concluded. In the calm of reflection, I understood that empowerment is quiet, deliberate, and profoundly transformative. The world outside would continue as before, but within me, everything had shifted. The patience endured, the strategy executed, and the dignity regained were now permanent fixtures of my existence. The apartment was filled with morning light, soft and steady, reflecting off the polished floors and the familiar surfaces I had carefully curated over months of independence. I moved through the rooms with ease, each space a testament to the life I had intentionally built, a life no longer dictated by others, no longer subject to subtle dominance or quiet undermining. The key rested on the counter, gleaming softly, its significance now layered with every lesson learned, every boundary asserted, and every victory earned. Coffee in hand, I stood by the window, looking out at the city that had witnessed my quiet transformation. The streets below moved with their usual rhythm, indifferent yet perfectly aligned with my own sense of purpose. The world continued, but my world, the one I had claimed through patience, strategy, and unwavering focus, felt wholly my own. Each object in the apartment, from the books neatly lined on the shelf to the photographs capturing moments of quiet achievement, reflected autonomy, intention, and a hard-earned serenity. Family dynamics had shifted, subtly yet irreversibly. Sarah no longer spoke with the assumed superiority that had once colored every interaction. Our exchanges were polite, measured, even cordial, but the balance of authority had permanently changed. Dad, too, had come to understand the depth of my independence and the quiet strength I had cultivated. Respect, previously withheld or assumed, was now evident in the way they approached me, with acknowledgement, without condescension. I sat at the dining table, the same polished surface where so many tense meals had unfolded, and let myself smile, a quiet, unforced expression of contentment. This table, once a stage of belittlement, now symbolized equilibrium, a neutral space where autonomy.com and mutual recognition coexisted. The subtle tension that had once lingered like an invisible fog had dissipated, replaced by clarity and respect. The key on the counter was more than a physical object. It was a symbol of transformation. It represented ownership, yes, but also autonomy, discipline, and deliberate action. Every time I picked it up or glanced at it, I was reminded that, true, control is earned through strategy and patience, that empowerment is cultivated as much in silence as in action. It was a talisman of the journey completed, a quiet affirmation of self-worth reclaimed. Looking around the apartment, I reflected on the path that had led here, the careful planning, the quiet endurance, the strategic patience, and the deliberate assertion of independence. Each challenge had been a lesson, each moment of doubt a step toward clarity, and every small victory a building block for the life I now fully commanded. Empowerment, I realized, was not loud or flashy. It was methodical, deliberate, and deeply satisfying. I paused by the window, letting the soft light illuminate my reflection in the glass. The person staring back was calm, confident, and at peace. The years of subtle oppression, the belittling laughter, the unearned assumptions of weakness, all were behind me, acknowledged but no longer defining me. I had transformed patience into action, endurance into mastery, and quiet observation into undeniable authority, silence, control, and freedom. The story of quiet revenge completed. The apartment, the key, the contracts, and the carefully orchestrated journey were all reminders that triumph need not be loud or violent. It could be patient, deliberate, and ultimately unassailable. The narrative of subjugation had ended, replaced by one of self-determination, empowerment, and serene, quiet victory. The journey was complete, but the life it had built, a life of autonomy, respect, and peace, had just begun.